I'm Valerie Levshin, and I'm a policy analyst with the Cost-Benefit Analysis Unit at the Vera Institute of Justice. And I'm here with Elizabeth Drake, who is a Senior Research Associate at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. This webinar is part of the Cost-Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice, which is a project of the Vera Institute of Justice and is funded by U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. In addition to webinars such as today's, the Cost-Benefit Knowledge Bank is developing a website which contains a wealth of information on cost-benefit and criminal justice, a cost-benefit toolkit, snapshots of cost-benefit literature, as well as podcasts, videocasts, and other resources on the topic. Today's webinar will focus on why evaluation is an important element of a cost-benefit analysis, different ways to assess program policy impacts, and what meta-analysis is and how it could be used in a cost-benefit analysis. So I'll begin by spending a couple of minutes on a few introductory and housekeeping items. Then I'll discuss the role of evaluation on cost-benefit analysis. Then I'll talk a little bit about some ways to assess program policy impacts. After that, we'll have a very short Q&A session, and then Elizabeth Drake will focus on meta-analysis and cost-benefit analysis. And at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes for a Q&A session. You can ask questions anytime during the webinar using the chat feature on the left-hand side of your screen. And we'll address your questions after different sections and at the end of the presentation. A couple of other housekeeping items. This webinar, if you have any trouble with the webinar, please call ReadyTalk at 1-800-843-9166 or email them at help@readytalk.com. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the PowerPoint will be posted on cbkb.org. So before we get started, I'd love to hear from you how familiar you are with the evaluation technique. So please take a moment and answer the question on your screen. Great. So the responses are coming in. It sounds like most of you are somewhat familiar with evaluation techniques. That's great. So I think Beth and I are going to try to keep that in mind as we go through the presentation. So now I'm going to go ahead and get started and discuss the role of evaluation in a cost-benefit analysis. So first, what is cost-benefit analysis? It's essentially a tool to compare the pros and cons of programs and policies. It's a great way to assess a particular program to see if it's worth investment, or to compare different programs to figure out which program or policy delivers the greatest results at least cost. And we tend to think of cost-benefit analysis as an approach to policymaking, in the sense that policymaking can be very political, and using cost-benefit analysis is a way to inject objective information into that process. So how do you do cost-benefit analysis? Well, the first step is to determine the impact of the initiative. What impact will it have on crime, criminal justice system operations, or any other desired outcome? And this will be the focus of today's presentation. The second step is to determine whose perspectives matter. In other words, whose cost benefits are you counting? And in criminal justice, a lot of times we think about the taxpayer or the budgetary perspective. We think about the victim or the public safety perspective. And also we think about the offender or the program participant perspective. Step 3 is to measure the cost of the initiative, both the startup and the operating costs. Step 4 is to measure the benefits. And this is where you place a dollar value on the impact that you measured in Step 1. The last step is to compare the costs and benefits to figure out if the program or policy is cost effective. So based on these steps, you could see the cost-benefit analysis is really only possible if there's information about program policy impacts. If we don't know what the impact of the policy is, we can't place a dollar value on that impact, and we can't measure the benefits. So the first step is always to evaluate the program or policy, or to draw on evaluation research to figure out, to predict what impact your program or policy will have in the future. So in the next section, I'm going to talk about a couple of ways to assess program and policy impacts. If the program or policy has already been implemented, the best approach is to evaluate the initiative. And you could use that using either a comparison group or a random assignment design. And I'll talk about that in a second. If the program or policy hasn't been implemented yet, or there's a number of initiatives that you're looking at, the best approach is to use existing evaluations of similar programs to predict the impact that your proposed initiative will have. So if the program or policy has already been implemented, one approach is to use a comparison group design. This is also known as quasi-experimental design to evaluate the program. In this approach, researchers compare the outcomes of people who are participating in a program to outcomes of a similar group of people who are not participating in the program. So for example, you could be looking at recidivism rates for formerly incarcerated individuals who are participating in a reentry employment program to a similar group of formerly incarcerated individuals who are not participating in the program. The trick here is to make sure that those groups are similar so that it's not their individual characteristics such as education or motivation levels that are contributing to their success, but it's the program. You also have to consider some outside factors, for example, crime rates or employment rates or the economy that might affect the outcome. But if you are able to find two groups, program group and comparison group, they're very similar, and you could do that using some statistical techniques, and you consider the other factors, but you see the differences in outcomes between the program group and the comparison group, then you can assume that a program indeed had an impact on the outcomes. So let me give you a quick example using that approach. So the Washington State Institute for Public Policy recently did an evaluation and a cost-benefit analysis of the drug offender sentencing alternative. And this was a law that was passed in '99 to reduce length of stay in prisons for drug offenders and also to provide them with some additional treatment alternatives. So what the researchers did was they compared the recidivism rates for drug offenders sentenced before that law was implemented and afterwards. And they found that the recidivism rates were indeed lower after the law was implemented, but only for the drug offenders, not for the drug-involved property offenders. So based on that finding, they estimated the benefits of that reduced recidivism rate and compared to that cost of implementing that initiative. And then they found that the benefit-cost ratio was actually about 7-to-1 or even 9-to-1 for the drug offenders, but it was less than 0 for the drug-involved property offenders. Now, another approach to evaluation is to do a random assignment design. This is also known as the experimental design. And in this design, researchers randomly assign people into participant group and comparison group, which is really the best way to create very similar groups. So if there's any difference in the outcomes, you can attribute that directly to the program. So just to give you an example of that very quickly, MDRC, a research institution in New York City, recently did an evaluation of the Center for Employment Opportunities, which is the nation's largest transitional job program for formerly incarcerated people. So MDRC randomly assigned parolees into the program and into the control group. Then it compared recidivism rates between people in the program and people in the control group and found that people in the program group had significantly lower recidivism rates. And then based on that, they estimated the dollar value of that recidivism reduction, compared that to the program cost, and determined that the benefit-cost ratio was about 3-to-1. And I should just mention that random assignment is sort of considered the gold standard of evaluation, but at the same time, it tends to be time-consuming and very expensive. So because of that, especially in criminal justice, comparison group design is a little bit more common. Now, if the program or policy hasn't been implemented yet, one approach is to draw on research or evaluations of similar programs or initiatives to try to predict the impact of your proposed initiative. And we actually had to do this recently in North Carolina, where we were trying to figure out what the recidivism rate would be of 16 and 17-year-olds if they were transferred into the juvenile system instead of being tried in the adult system. So what we did was look through the research, and we found several studies with quite varying results. Some of the studies showed that recidivism rates were about 50% lower for adolescents being tried in the juvenile instead of adult system. Some of them showed that they were only a couple percentage points lower. So what we did was make a prudent assumption that the recidivism rates would reduce by about 10%. And based on that, we did a cost-benefit analysis. And then what we did was do a sensitivity analysis showing how using different recidivism reduction 5%, 10%, 20% would affect the cost-benefit results. And another approach to using existing literature is you do a meta-analysis, which is to review literature more systematically to really estimate the average effect of a program policy on the outcome. And Beth will discuss that in greater detail in just a second. So I covered quite a few approaches. Which one should you use? Well, it really depends on the situation. It depends on the time, the resources, and the staff expertise that you have at hand. You should aim for stronger research designs because the more rigorous the evaluation, the more accurate the results, and the more accurate the cost-benefit results. But because random assignment is expensive and time-consuming and is just not feasible sometimes, for example, if you don't have the program implemented yet, then you have to draw on existing literature to try to predict the impact. So that concludes my section of the presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Please feel free to use the chat window on the left side of your screen to send us any questions. So it looks like we don't have too many questions at the moment. So I think we're going to go ahead and I'll ask Beth to take over.
Hi there. My name is Elizabeth Drake. I work for the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. And just to give you a little bit of background on what the Institute does is we work we're a nonpartisan research outfit. We work for our state legislature. And we do things like outcome evaluations for the legislature. They direct all of our assignments. But in more recent years, we've actually gotten into doing a lot of cost-benefit work. And the legislature asked us to come up with a consumer reports list basically of what works and what doesn't work and what can give Washington taxpayers a good return on investment for their taxpayer dollars. So we've gotten into in recent years doing meta-analysis and cost-benefit analysis. So like Valerie said, cost-benefit analysis is one approach to policy making. It's really a language I think that a lot of people understand, and so I think that this is why it's become more popular throughout the nation, but also why our legislature relies on good cost-benefit work. So we do cost-benefit work not only in, my focus today is on criminal justice, but we also do cost-benefit on various outcomes like child abuse and neglect and ways to increase high school graduation or decrease substance abuse. So it really is a concept that translates across many different fields. So our cost-benefit model actually began as a public utility model and has transformed into more of the social service world these days. So meta-analysis, so what I'll cover today are the meta-analytical concepts. So I'll talk a little bit about research design quality and discount factors, and then I'll talk a little bit about cost-benefit concepts and the different criminal justice resources that we monetize. So what I won't cover are cost-benefit data and calculations, so, or meta-analytic calculations. So there's a lot of mathematical information that goes into cost-benefit analysis, and we rely on Mark Lipsey and David Wilson's practical meta-analysis. So we're going to stick with the concepts today, and if you want more detailed information, I'm happy to answer questions and also happy to refer you to Mark Lipsey's work because he really is a true expert on this. So talking about meta-analysis, what is meta-analysis? It's an empirical summarization of the literature. So it's different from, say for example, literature review where you're sort of summarizing anecdotally what the literature says about the effectiveness of a given program. So the difference is that you're mathematically coming up with an average effect on something, whatever that outcome is. So in this case, we're talking about crime, but it can be something like I said earlier, graduation or child abuse and neglect. But generally, when you're trying to do cost-benefit analysis, it has to be an outcome that you can monetize. So crime can be monetized. So for example, there might be studies out there that look at, whether or not a program increases customer satisfaction or increases an offender's feelings of support throughout the reentry process or something along those lines. But those are outcomes that you can't generally monetize. So that's one thing you want to focus in on, is that you're coming up with something that you can later monetize to use in cost-benefit analysis. So the unit of measurement in meta-analysis is called an effect size. The effect size is basically the degree to which a program has been shown to change an outcome, in this case recidivism or crime, to change an outcome for participants relative to the comparison group or non-participants. So not all research is of equal quality, and this greatly influences the confidence that can be placed in the results of a study. So your meta-analysis will only be as good as the selection and the coding criteria that are used to conduct the study. So I'll go over important criteria that the Institute uses to determine the inclusion of studies. So we generally tend to take a conservative approach. So all the recommendations I give you today are just based on what it is that we do. But when you're doing meta-analysis, these are kind of guidelines and the most important things to consider. So first, what we do at the Institute is when we're searching for studies, we look at published and unpublished studies. So the reason why we do this is because it's shown in the literature that there can actually be a bias towards published studies. So studies that show up in journals tend to show more of a treatment effect than studies that don't show up in journals. So we look at both published and unpublished, and which sometimes I'll also refer to as the gray literature. So there are a lot of good outcome evaluations out there that are done by government agencies or various institutes, and so that's something that we keep in mind when we're doing our literature searches. So one of the most important things to think about when you're determining whether or not a study should be included in your meta-analysis is whether or not it's a comparison group study. So comparison group studies are really the only real way to attribute causality of a given program. So we never include studies that only use a single group, so a treatment group where there's a pre and a post research design. So say, for example, they may measure how much crime do the offenders partake in before the program, how much crime do they partake in after the program. It's not the best way to determine causality, and so what we do are only look at comparison group studies where there are non-participants. Another important criteria to consider, and this is really important, it doesn't always happen when you review the literature out there, but it's called intent to treat sampling procedures. So, which is when studies only look at people who complete the program. So you may or may not have heard about selection bias, which is where people are more, they self-select, or they're more motivated to participate or even complete a program. And so what you don't want to do is, when you're looking at studies for your meta-analysis, is only look at studies that have completers, because it really will bias the treatment effect if you only look at studies that have completers. So in the real world, there are people who participate and drop out, and there are people who intend to participate and drop out. And so you really do want to get an average effect, or you want to get an understanding of what's the average effect for this particular program. So that's an important factor to consider. And then we also, well, one of the important things is that there has to be a crime outcome when you're coding studies for your meta-analysis, if that's your outcome of interest. So there can be multiple outcome measures when you're looking at different studies. So for example, there are different ways in which the authors may report the outcomes. So they might report recidivism as a dichotomous outcome. Did the offender recidivate or not recidivate? Or they might report the outcome in, say for example, continuous outcome, which would be a mean number of arrests, so the average number of arrests for the treatment group. And so there are a whole bunch of different ways, and every author out there has a different way of doing it, but it's okay. You can still gather information from all of these different studies and average the effect. And the important thing is that you develop a systematic way of looking at the outcomes that you're interested in. So for example, at the Institute, we're interested in felony convictions because those are really the outcomes that generate the most criminal justice system dollars. And so those are the things that if an author reports misdemeanor convictions and felony convictions, then we code felony convictions. So the important thing is that there are specific details when you're coding studies for a meta-analysis that you need to make a decision about and back up your rationale for why you're making those decisions. So because not all studies are created equal, we've come up with an adjustment factor to adjust the effect sizes, the individual effect sizes from the studies. And it's really our judgment about our concern for the research design quality. So, and these are not necessarily, you could come up with different discounts, and these are just the discounts that we use. But the more important thing here is that we don't treat all studies of equal quality. So we do give random assignment studies because we know that random assignment studies, literature shows that random assignment study, that research design quality actually has an effect on the strength of the effect size. So random assignment studies tend to find a smaller effect size, and less well-implemented quasi-experimental studies tend to find larger effect sizes. And that's just because there can be, if you don't have a good comparison group, some of that, what's assumed to be the treatment effect, might actually just be because the treatment group is more motivated. So what we do is we just come up with these discounts and basically assign them. When we read studies, we grade them and assign the discounts accordingly. We also discount for a couple of other things too. So for example, if a study is not a real-world evaluation, so for example, it's done in a lab setting, which you see this and you actually see it more in like the psychology literature, but you might see studies where there are psychology students participating with professor, and so we don't count those studies as being real-world evaluations. So, and then we also discount for when the evaluation researcher is the program developer. So there are two issues with this and why we discount for such a circumstance. One is that the evaluation researcher might actually deliver the program better than the evaluation researcher might deliver the program better than, say, just your average person out there who's implementing the program. Because they're the program developer, they might be more charismatic and it might not be replicable. And so we want to account for the fact that the developer knows the program more intimately than another person might know the program. And then we also, the second reason for this, for discounting this, is because there might be a conflict of interest when the evaluation researcher is actually the program developer, and we want to account for that potential bias. Thirdly, we also discount for and make adjustments to effect sizes for weak outcome measures. So for example, what we consider to be a weak outcome measure would be incarceration or maybe even technical violation behavior. Mostly just that incarceration, we believe it would underestimate the true impact of recidivism or the true impact of crime. And so we would discount for that. And then the important thing here is that whatever you come up with for your adjustments to effect sizes, you just want to make sure that you come up with an internally consistent set of procedures. So there might be drift from day to day or from researcher to researcher, and so you just want to make sure that you're always going back and cross-checking between coders and making sure that you're coding things consistently. And we do that a lot here at the Institute, where we will get 2 people coding one area of studies. So I might code and then go over those with my cross-coder to make sure would they code them the same. So are there any questions at this point?
Yes, Beth, actually we have quite a few interesting questions. One question is, how do you handle studies that show no impact on an outcome?
Oh, well, we still code them. I mean, there doesn't have to be an effect or no effect in the program evaluation. We code all studies as long as they meet our minimum rigor design requirements. We code them. And so you'll just end up getting a really small effect size. So then what happens is you might have a small effect size for that particular study, but then what you're doing is you're coming up with the overall average effect size when you put all of those studies together. So they still get coded.
Great. And when we talk about sample sizes, how large should a sample size be? We account for that. So we do code studies that have really small sample sizes. So, and this kind of gets into the nitty-gritty details, but there are these weights called inverse variance weights that get produced so that when you're coming up with the calculation of an effect size, you give more weight to studies that have larger ends and less weight to studies that have smaller ends. So really there's no limit on how many participants or how big the sample sizes need to be. You just account for that mathematically later and give more weight to the studies that have bigger ends. And what would you consider bigger? Over 50, over 100?
Well, it really just depends on the program literature. So for example, I know like in child welfare, the child welfare literature, there are going to be a lot smaller ends. In the criminal justice field, there are a lot larger ends. So, it's hard for me to say necessarily what's considered a large end or a small end. You might even see a difference between, you might see, for example, smaller ends in the juvenile justice field, but larger ends in the adult field. So, I guess I would consider a large end. I've conducted outcome evaluations that have had thousands and thousands of observations, and then I've also conducted outcome evaluations in the juvenile justice field that have had maybe 100 observations. So it just depends.
Great, interesting. Okay, another question has to do with how do you find unpublished literature, that gray literature that you mentioned? Google Scholar is really the Internet really is just a great resource, and Google Scholar is a great resource. There are definitely some websites out there that I'll specifically go to, for example, like the Urban Institute. What I would recommend doing is when you're starting a literature review, go out there and come up with a systematic way of how you're going to gather the evidence. There are also, I can't remember, there's like the National Correctional website, I can't remember the name of the organization, but they also have like a literature archive. And so what you really want to do is come up with a way of what are different organizations that you think might have some gray literature. And then you'll also see, in reference lists, that's a great way to come up with good literature. Start by finding a meta-analysis maybe that's already out there. Mm-hmm. Okay, and maybe just one more question. How do you handle international studies?
We do include international studies, so we actually don't really treat them any differently necessarily. I suppose we might be more cautious if there's a mix of international studies out there. We just now are getting to the point where we're tracking which studies are from the United States and which studies are not. And so we may or may not actually deal with that in a mathematical way. We have the capability of doing that, but right now we treat them the same. But if you're going to make a statement, an overall statement about program area, it's something to consider, I think, more in the anecdotal part or the conveying of the message is that, okay, well, there may be 17 studies, but 12 of them are from Scotland. And so maybe that is a little bit less meaningful for something that you want to do here in the United States.
Okay, well, thank you, Beth. I think that's all we have for now.
Okay, so moving on then. So meta-analysis and cost-benefit, how do they go together? So once we have our unit of measurement, our effect size, we want to know how much does it cost to buy that effect size and what's it worth to achieve it. So the effect size, remember, is relative to the base population, or people who don't participate in the program. So when we do cost-benefit analysis, and the way we do it in criminal justice in particular, is we come up with estimates to determine how often does crime happen, and when it does happen, what criminal justice system resources are used, what resources are evoked by the system, and for how long. So for example, if a crime occurs, there may or may not be an arrest associated with that crime that has occurred. With that arrest, there may or may not be prison associated with that. So you calculate the probability that all these resources may be used, and then you calculate how long they're used, and then you put a price tag on those estimates. And so basically, you also come up with a cost estimate for being a victim of crime too. So it's not just the cost-benefit results don't just incorporate criminal justice system or taxpayer dollars, but they also incorporate victimization dollars too. And so once you come up with those, the effect size and the resource responses, and then you're able to come up with some cost-benefit results. So I'll give you an example. So right now I'm actually coding cognitive behavioral treatment. I've been reading these studies for many weeks now, and this is our current estimate, although this will change because I'm currently working on it. But right now at the Institute we're in the process of re-reviewing all the criminal justice literature. So we're hoping to have new results by this July. And so this is just kind of a sample of some draft results. So for adult offenders, cognitive behavioral treatment, as of now we have 27 studies that were rigorous enough to include in our meta-analysis, and resulting in a 4% crime change for people who participate in the program. So after we monetize all the criminal justice system responses, and then you back out the costs for the program, you come up with $7,100 in benefits per person. And this is life cycle benefits. So we also, with our cost-benefit model, have the ability to do what we call sensitivity analysis, which is the probability that for this given investment that you would actually lose money. And so because the effect size is fairly large for the criminal justice literature, and because the program is pretty cost-effective, the probability of losing crime is less than 1%. So basically the sensitivity analysis varies all sorts of different pieces of information. You have error, standard error in your effect size, and so you just want to know, given all of these different pieces of error, what's the probability that we might lose money. So just to give you an example, there are a couple of other adult offender programs and juvenile offender programs up there. And just to give you an example, so for intensive supervision, probation, and parole, with just surveillance, not with treatment, you get a small effect size, minus 2%. But because the benefits don't outweigh the cost of the program, you actually come up with negative cost per participant. So to me, this really highlights a good example of why it's important not just to look at the effectiveness of the program, but to incorporate the cost benefit too. Because if we look at just the effectiveness of the program, you see 2% reduction in crime, but you take it to the next step and you see, well, this really, the cost of the program don't outweigh the benefits. So, and then intensive supervision for probation and parole coupled with treatment, though, there's an 18% crime reduction, and those benefits do outweigh the costs. So, putting it all together, basically it's results and more results. So your meta-analysis and your cost-benefit analysis can inform stakeholders where your resources are best utilized. But the results will only tell you the average effect for that particular program. And so it doesn't hurt then to, once you implement the program, to follow up with an outcome evaluation to ensure that you're getting the results that you would expect. So as an example, in Washington, back in the 90s, in the juvenile justice system, people were trying to figure out, what evidence-based programs might there be that they could implement in the juvenile justice system. And so what happened is back then the Institute did a meta-analysis to see, well, what are the best programs? They did a meta-analysis and a cost-benefit analysis to see what programs are effective and give you the best bang for your buck. So after that meta-analysis found out that there are a couple of programs like functional family therapy and aggression replacement training, for example. And so the state decided, okay, let's fund these programs. The programs were implemented, funded, implemented in the juvenile courts, and then what happened was we did a follow-up outcome evaluation to make sure that we were getting the results that we would have expected given the meta-analysis. And we actually found out that the outcome evaluation indicated that we weren't getting the expected results. And so in looking at it further, there are some therapists that weren't delivering the program with adherence to the model or with quality assurance. And so those therapists actually had their caseload actually had a higher recidivism rate than the therapists who delivered the program competently. So a couple lessons were learned from that. One being the importance of quality assurance, and that's a whole separate topic, which I can talk about that too. But it's not the point of this particular presentation. But so quality assurance matters. But then it also tells you that what we found is that really the results were getting washed out because of those findings. And so doing the follow-up outcome evaluation really helped to know that we weren't getting the results that we expected, and we needed to make adjustments, which then we were able to make. So that's an example in Washington. Are there any more questions?
Hi, Beth. Yes, we have quite a few questions. One question is about program fidelity. How do you account for that when you look at studies for meta-analysis?
So what we do is not all programs have quality assurance or program fidelity. And so unless they tell you in the outcome evaluation, you just don't necessarily know for sure. So, but what we do is nowadays, so for example, when we're coding our functional family therapy studies, and I think I could actually go back and show you a few slides ago. Oops. Here we go. Let's see here. There we go. Had to use the markup tool. So that effect for functional family therapy, the WF, that's with fidelity. So what we do nowadays is if there are programs that we know about that actually are delivered with fidelity, we'll put those programs in a meta-analysis together, and then other functional family therapy programs that have not been done with program fidelity, we'll put them in their own meta-analysis. So basically you're coming up with two different statements, and that's the way that we've done it in recent years.
Okay, and another question. What about studies that don't get published because they don't have an effect size at all?
Well, I'm not certain if they don't get published. I mean, those are the studies that if it's not necessarily a report, but it's like a draft paper, we'll come across those, and we'll still code those if we have the ability to get access to those types of reports. But so that's kind of one answer. If you have the ability, if it has the appropriate outcome, and it can be coded. But if it doesn't have an effect size because it doesn't have the right outcome, then those studies don't get coded.
Okay. And just to go back to a point about program fidelity really quickly, is program fidelity the same thing as quality assurance?
Yes, yes.
It is.
I
Okay.
use them interchangeably.
Okay. We have another question about cost-benefit studies generally. The question is that cost-benefit analysis results differ, just like evaluation results. So is there any way to replicate cost-benefit studies just like you would replicate an evaluation, or has that been done?
Not that I know of. I mean, I think that your cost-benefit results, I mean, it really, the devil is going to be in the detail, you know, and what exactly you're monetizing and what you're including. And so it would be hard to, you know, replicate, especially across, you know, one research group to another research group. It just kind of depends on how exactly you're coming up with how often those system responses happen, and then how long do they happen when you do have a crime, and then how you come up with those cost estimates too for each of those different resources. So I don't know necessarily that it would be easy to replicate cost-benefit results from one place to the next, but you know, I would definitely be very aware of, if you're trying to interpret cost-benefit results, what exactly is it that they're including in their analysis. I mean, I would definitely pay attention to a technical appendix on that.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions about cost specifically. So can you speak really briefly on how do you put a dollar value on effect sizes?
How you put a dollar value on effect sizes?
Or how do you, if you have an evaluation that shows that a particular program is effective and reduces recidivism rates, how do you put a dollar value on that? How do you measure that?
Yeah, that all goes into the dollar value that you put on the criminal justice system resources. So if you have an effect size, say for example, that is for a juvenile offender population, what we do is, should go back to, let's see, this slide here. It's all going to be relative to the base population. So if you have, for example, a juvenile probation population, what you do is you estimate what's your criminal justice system response for the people who participate in that program versus not participate. And so your base population are, that we use to come up with those estimates are, what's the recidivism rate of the overall juvenile probation population? And then what you do is you translate your effect size from your meta-analysis into a percentage change crime reduction. And then if you have, say for example, a 50% recidivism rate for a juvenile probation population over 10 years. And we use all Washington offender population data. So it's real data that exists based on all of our offender population. So if you have a 50% recidivism rate for that offender population, and your effect size translates what's the equivalent to a 5 percentage point change in crime because they participate in the program, then you're monetizing basically the difference between 45% recidivism rate and 50% recidivism rate, and that's how you come up with your cost-benefit analysis, is the difference between those two percentages and how the system responds to those two percentages. So what we look at is for that given population, for that juvenile probation population, how often do they commit crimes? And over a given, whatever that recidivism period is, if it's a 10-year period, what kinds of crimes do they commit? And there are price tags that are associated with those crimes. So more serious crimes will have higher taxpayer dollars associated with them than less serious crimes. And so, and then we also look at how often do they go through the system over that full follow-up period. And that's all about the criminal justice system resources and responses, and by looking at that specific population, if that makes sense.
And just to add to that really quickly, I should mention that the website for the Washington State Institute of Public Policy has a wealth of reports with cost-benefit studies that describe the methodology. So what we're going to do is send a link in the chat feature to WISIP's website. So you may want to browse that website for resources on estimating costs. We're also going to send you a link to a recent study on victimization costs. It's a recent study by McAllister and his colleagues from Florida. So you can use that study as well to measure victimization costs.
Yeah, that's the study that we use when we estimate victimization costs, because they're really, the national literature is the best literature to rely on to come up with victimization costs.
Well, one question actually directly asked if there are standards for which outcomes to monetize in a criminal justice. And a lot of times what we're looking at is criminal justice expenditures. So if a program reduces recidivism rates, there's fewer crimes, fewer people are going through the systems, and that's savings to criminal justice system. And we look at victimization benefits, because if there are fewer crimes, fewer victims, and fewer victimization costs. And you can use the McAllister study for that. I should also mention that our website for the cost-benefit knowledge bank, which is www.cbkb.org, has a cost-benefit toolkit and some other information both on evaluation and cost-benefit analysis and how to place a dollar value on outcomes. Well, at this point, I don't think we have any other questions, so I'm going to do a very quick wrap-up. Well, what we hope you learned today was why evaluation is an important element of a cost-benefit analysis, a couple of ways to assess program policy impact, and how meta-analysis can be used in a CBA. So when you log off this webinar, please complete the evaluation form when you leave the training. To receive information and notifications about upcoming webinars and other events, please visit the Cost-Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice website at www.cbkb.org, where you can subscribe to receive updates from CBKB. You can also follow us on Twitter. Our username is CBKBank. We use Twitter pretty frequently to share information about cost-effective practices in criminal justice and send updates about new resources on doing cost-benefit analysis. The next webinar in several months will focus on discussing cost-benefit results with the media. So stay tuned for updates. Just one more time, I want to thank our funder, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, for making this webinar possible. If anyone has any other questions, please feel free to contact me or Beth using the contact information on your screen. Thank you very much.